We're working our way through missions discussions, and what I've got here is a questionnaire that our church uses when we have people that contact us. They want to raise support, and we have a limited number of people that we can actually have in for our missions months. And so the purpose of this questionnaire is for us to get to know people, know a little bit more than just their doctrinal statement, or a recommendation from someone. And I've used this in other times, and I don't necessarily have, like, someone has to answer every single question exactly what I'm looking for, but there are some things that are non-negotiable on here as well. So I want to talk to you about this a little bit and explain to you the reason behind why we have what we do. And so we're going to talk about how we vet missions candidates. And this is a work in progress. So whenever someone emails our church and they are wanting to raise support, we send them this questionnaire. If they don't fill it out, then that's the end of it. If they fill it out, we'll review it. And if I look over this and I feel like this looks like a really good candidate, I'll give them a call, have a conversation with them, and see if we can schedule them for a meeting. And so here's some of the things that we have here. I put this in our opening part. We're a missions-minded church. They will be partnered with wonderful like-minded missionaries. Our church takes each partnership seriously, stays in regular communication with these missionaries, and supports each family at a significant monthly support level. Because of the high volume of requests, we limit missionary visits to the month of October with few exceptions. And we believe that we should partner with people who are practically and theologically like-minded. So the first question I have on here is, could they in good conscience support our faith and practice statement? Now, I'm not asking would this person join Anchor Baptist Church if they lived in this community. But what I'm asking is, could you join the church in good conscience? Okay? There are certain things in our Constitution that are stated that if you're a Presbyterian, you wouldn't join our church, okay? Or if you were Baptistic but you didn't have certain beliefs, you wouldn't necessarily hold those. There are certain areas where sometimes a person will ask questions, particularly in eschatology, and we work through those issues. But I would like to know that a missionary that desires to be supported by our church would actually want to be a part of this church if they were here. Another question I ask is, do you and your wife consider yourself healthy, growing Christians? Now that's starting with an assumption. Are you married? Okay? And I've had people ask me, are you against supporting a single missionary? And the answer is no, but I'm very cautious, and I would probably not do it. And you say, well, why is that? Well, it's because we're looking to partner with primarily church planters. And partnering with church planters means that if you're going to be a pastor planting a church, you should be married, who is actually planting a church with a spouse. And there's a lot of practical reasons for that. One of the things that we encountered when we were over in Ghana was we had a guy who we were talking about ordaining. And getting closer to that date, I realized that there was a little angst in people's hearts, and I couldn't figure out why, and nobody wanted to say. So finally, I sat down with him, and I said, something seems a little up. What is it? Just tell me. I'm not going to get upset at you. I just want to know what's on your mind on this issue. And he said, well, Pastor, this guy's not married. I was like, okay. So he's not qualified. I said, okay. He said, well, how can you be the husband of one wife if you're not married? I was like, okay. How do you rule your household well, having your children in subjection with all sobriety if you don't have children? It's like, okay. So we had to talk through this issue. And basically what he said was, in our culture, if someone isn't married, then they are not going to be viewed as someone who should run a church. I said, okay, interesting. Because in America, we don't necessarily have this mindset. However, I would say that, practically speaking, there are a lot of things that a single man who's trying to pastor a church cannot do effectively. And so I want to know, are you married? And do you consider yourself to be a healthy, growing Christian? You say, well, That's a very introspective question. I don't mean a perfect Christian, but I mean you're growing. I mean that you are actually in a healthy place. If you were to ask a friend or your pastor, is this couple, do they have a strong marriage? Do they have a healthy walk with God? If they start looking down and they're like, well, why would we send someone like that to a mission field? So I want to know that question. The next question is, have you or your wife ever been divorced? And what are the circumstances? Now, I am of the view that if someone is going to be a pastor or deacon, they cannot be divorced. But there are people in roles that would not be pastor or deacon, that would fall in the missions category, who maybe have been divorced and they're remarried. And I would like to know the circumstances. Again, I'm not really looking to bring on someone who is not a church planter, but let's say someone helps ministry where they help with, building church buildings, different things like that, an assisting role. There are situations that I would consider. So I do ask that question. Do you have a healthy family do you have a healthy family culture? Now, tell me, what do you think I mean by a healthy family culture? There's some things out there. Go ahead.
You are not being abusive.
Okay. Yes, that would be a good example. Yes. You'd be surprised how many pastors or missionaries have horrific tempers. And their family life is not good. And the fact is that there are a lot of kids who grew up in pastors' homes that they hate God. You know why they hate God? The church? Because they grew up in a home of someone who shouldn't have been a pastor. I hate to say that. Shouldn't have been a missionary. And someone can always lie and say, yeah, we have a great family culture, and it's not true. But at least the question is being asked. Another question. Are your wife and children fully supportive of your ministry focus, and to what extent do you envision their involvement in the work? Can anyone explain why that might be an important question to ask?
Because you don't want to be dragging unwilling participants.
Sure. Now, there are some people that will counsel an individual. It's sad to say this, but it's true. They'll say, well, if your wife's not on board, she needs to just submit to your authority and go with you. I hate to say this, but that will not end well. And there are people that will actually suggest that. Or, it doesn't matter what your kids think. You're in charge of the family. So your kids, they're not able to veto that decision. But here's the fact. You go into another culture, your kids are growing up in that culture. If you're going to continue to be qualified for ministry, your family's going to be evaluated. They're going to be observed. Can people really respect how you raise your children and what's being produced in that home? Well, the fact is that if you have contention between a husband and wife about ministry, or between the children and their parents, then that's a family that should not go into that kind of a role. And there are people that would disagree with me on that, but I strongly am of the view, having observed missionary families, that this is a very important issue.
But that really just goes back to the healthy family culture.
Healthy family culture. Absolutely right. And those are two questions that, what's funny is someone may say, well, I have a healthy family culture, but my wife's really not super excited about this, but she's going to go with it. If somebody says that, then I start going, I'm going to ask a few more questions about this. I may ask my wife to have a conversation with her wife, with his wife, his wife. I may ask the kids some questions. Those are some things that are going to come up. And someone might say, well, not fair. No, it is fair. Because your family's going to come under a lot of pressure in a cross-cultural context. The question of to what extent do you envision your family being involved is another great question, because sometimes you'll have a husband who's very ministry-minded and his wife is not as much. Or a wife. I've seen missionaries like this. I think the wife is the one driving them to the field, not the husband. Okay? And you know, the wife is the one who's answering all the questions and the question and answer. She's the one that is talking in the video presentation, and you start getting the sense like maybe the guy is just along for the ride because his wife has always wanted to be a missionary since she was a little kid, and he's going to go with it. But the truth is that you're a team. Most of what I do in ministry, I cannot do it unless my wife and I are working together on it. I don't meet alone with ladies in our church. In fact, sometimes I don't even counsel ladies in our church. My wife does it. Or sometimes she and I do it together. Or I will have a meeting with the husband and the wife together, but then my wife and I will discuss how to help the wife in a situation. Well, the fact is that you have to have a ministry-minded couple. You have to be willing to open up your home, to have people into your home. You have to be willing to be scrutinized. Your children are going to experience pressures that the average kid in the church doesn't experience. You're going to have to work through all those things. And so these are some of the questions that are very important. If I see a missionary candidate who has teenagers, I'm going to scrutinize that family a lot more than if they're little kids. And the reason for that is because a teenager going to the mission field is going into a massive cultural shift, and they're much more socially aware than a small child is. A small child growing up on the mission field doesn't understand the cultural differences when they're really little. They don't feel those tensions and pressures the same way. But a teenager, very different. And it could be something that leads to rebellion and contention and frustration. And those are things that are going to be scrutinized. Another question. List your completed theological training and the institutions that you've studied in. Now, I am not a person who drives people to a certain Bible college, okay? I want to see our young people go to Bible college, but I know that some of them aren't going to go to Bible college, and I'm okay with that. I think every family has to make these decisions themselves. But what you know is that where you choose to train in school says something about what you believe. It says something about the philosophy and the emphasis that you have. And it says something about how you've been shaped. There are certain things about the way that I think that they honestly are the result of how I was trained. And you know, I try to just let the Bible be my guide and try to do things biblically, but the fact is that in the formative years of my life in seminary, a lot of my thinking was shaped by the teachers that I had and the context that I was in. And sometimes I reacted against some of the things that I heard based on me feeling like it wasn't a strong argument. But this tells you a lot about a person's theological viewpoint. Or they may say, well, this is where I went to school, and I know some things about that school, and I'm just going to ask them some theological questions because I want to know, are you kind of the mind of this school in these areas, or are you not of the mind? And I want to pick up on some of those things. And if someone is going to train men for ministry, there needs to be some real equipping on their side. There are pastors that do an excellent job, and they don't have a master's or a doctorate or something like that, and they're excellent pastors. But the truth is that you do need an extended level of training in order to grow in certain areas. And so if someone's going to go to the mission field, I'd like to know that they've actually had seminary level training. If they're going to be training pastors and discipling people, I want to know that they have a level of training that is appropriate for what they're getting into. Let me pause there and ask, are there any questions about some of the things we talked about? Next question. Tell us when you were ordained and in what church you were ordained. Why would I ask that question? I'm assuming that they are ordained. Now, do you think that, getting into my head here, do you think that I would potentially consider a missionary who'd not been ordained?
Sounds like no, because there's the question.
Well, I wouldn't say absolutely no. I want to know about the church. So some churches don't believe in ordination the way that we do it here. And where we have a formal council that sits down with the candidate and they bring in pastors and they ask questions. This is kind of funny, but when I was here many years ago, I remember going to an ordination council for Pastor Counterman's son Simeon. Pastor Counterman's son Simeon was ordained at the same time as Simeon's senior pastor, Pastor Troutman. Pastor Troutman had been a senior pastor for a long time at this church. And the question was, well, was he never ordained? And the answer is, no, he wasn't. And it was very obvious listening to him handle questions on the council that he's a competent pastor and the people submitted to his teaching and instruction. So the question is, well, what was the problem? Well, the fact is he was in a context where they didn't do ordination the same way that we do it here. Charles Spurgeon was never ordained. Neither was Martin Lloyd-Jones. I love Spurgeon and Martin Lloyd-Jones. I especially love Martin Lloyd-Jones. Martin Lloyd-Jones never went to formal seminary either, nor did Charles Spurgeon. So there are some exceptions that I would consider, but the bottom line is if a church has an ordination process and they're unwilling to ordain someone, that's a problem. Or if a person has not gotten to the point where the church feels comfortable doing it, that's a problem. And the kind of church that they attend that has sent them out says something about their level of training and their philosophy of ministry. And if someone was ordained in one church, but then they left that church and now they're sent out of another church, I'd like to know why they're not sent out of the church they were ordained in when it's in the same community. Like, that's kind of strange to me. So these are some of the questions that, it's not a write-off, but it's a couple more questions. Because these are people that we like to partner with long term. We don't want to partner with them for 6 months or a year and a half. We want to partner with them for a decade or 20 years. We want them to be faithful men who are well prepared and who those who are sending them out are really behind them and what they're doing. And I'll add this. If we were in a situation where we were going to send out a missionary, and we kind of did this with Chris, to be honest with you. Technically, Chris views this as his sending church. He's actually still a member at Anchor, believe it or not, because with FBFI, he retains his membership. And, ordination was a part of the process that said our church is behind him going into the chaplaincy. We believe that this is a ministry that he will do fine in, and we're behind him on that. And so that's something that, we did as a part of the process for him. So if we were going to send out a missionary, before they went out on deputation, I'd want there to be an ordination so that the churches that are having him in would say, we know that this church is behind him. They believe that God's hand is on this man and that he's qualified for ministry. And so that's kind of the thinking of those questions there. Next question. Explain what you believe are the absolute essential elements to the gospel that must be affirmed and trusted for salvation. Question. If someone lays that out and they don't say anything about the resurrection of Christ, do you think that's going to make me concerned? Yes! Or they don't say anything about Christ being God in flesh. Is that going to make me concerned? Absolutely. Or if the way that they define repentance and faith is very fuzzy, is that going to make me concerned? Absolutely it will. If they're very surfacey, well, you just ask the Lord to save you. I'm going to ask some questions. Well, is that's all there is to the gospel? Like, I just pray a prayer. I don't know anything about Jesus. I don't know anything about the cross. I don't know anything about the resurrection. I don't know anything about who Jesus is. Is that the gospel? We need to send out the sharpest people from our churches to go be missionaries. Sometimes churches send out, well, you could never cut it in the U.S. People in the States wouldn't want to listen to your preaching week in and week out. So we'll send you to the mission field where they really need people, and you might have a blessed ministry over there. There's people that think that way. It's sad but true. But the fact is that your most rigorous sharpest, theologically astute people, they're the ones you want to send to the mission field because they're dealing with very complex situations. They're dealing with almost entirely first-generation Christians. And everything they're doing is from the ground up. And so they need to be well-grounded and they need to think carefully in their ability to articulate the gospel. Next question. Do you have a planned way to handle baptism candidates? And if so, what is your plan? Now, I've had people say things to me like, well, in the book of Acts, they baptized them the day they trusted Christ. So that's what I'm going to do. Well, that's fine if that's what you want to do. But how many different understandings of baptism did they have at Pentecost? They had one. Okay? Were you in the good graces of the Sanhedrin or the bad graces of the Sanhedrin if you got baptized? The bad. I mean, they just crucified Jesus, right? 50 days before Pentecost, Jesus was crucified. So people were not getting baptized because it was the cool and trendy thing to do. And people were not associating with baptism things that today are being associated with baptism because of all the doctrinal confusion that's going on in certain places. And so what I like to see someone say is, well, there are some basic teachings that we want to go through before a person's baptized in order to make sure they understand the gospel, they understand what baptism is, what it isn't, and they're actually following the Lord in believers' baptism the way that they should. And in our church, as a general rule, we actually do that. Now, I do a little bit different when we're dealing with children, okay? With children who are growing up in our church. First of all, I want to know that the parents have confident that they believe their child's trusted Christ. I'm going to ask them questions. We go through a baptism booklet with them. Usually the parents go through that. Usually I don't do that. But if they want me to, I'll do that. I'm totally fine with that. But when we're dealing with someone that's a little bit older, a teenager, an adult, we actually go through a discipleship book with them. Most people are going through discipleship for a couple of months before they get baptized in our church. And the reason we do that is because we want them to know what baptism is and what it isn't. And actually, a lot of people in our church, believe it or not, who've gotten baptized got saved as a result of our discipleship studies. A lot of them. Because I have somebody, they'll come to the church for a while, we'll visit with them once, and the assessment will be, I don't think they understand the gospel. They didn't get saved in that meeting. They keep coming. We might have another meeting with them or that. We may try to set up a discipleship study with them. They may say something like, hey, I'd like to join the church. How do I do that? I'll set up a discipleship with them. Second or third lesson is when they get saved. It's happened with quite a few people in our church in the last couple of years. Why do we do that? Well, because we want to make sure they understand the gospel, they understand baptism. So again, I'm not expecting a missionary to do it exactly how I do it, okay? But what I want them to do, I want to see is that this is a person that understands I'm going into a context that has assumptions. And those assumptions are not necessarily biblical. And so I need to have some kind of a pattern that I'm going to follow. It could be a class, it could be a study. If they ask me what would you suggest, I'd be glad to tell them. There's great tools out there. Most missionaries don't use good tools. They write their own. Because nothing's good enough for them. But I'm laughing, but it's true. That's how most missionaries are. But want them to have something that they do. Explain the heart of your focus as a missionary or American church planter. What do you think I mean by that? The heart of your focus. Go ahead.
Your main goal.
Okay. What would be some things that would fall into that category? That you would think are falling in that category? Yeah?
Church planting.
Okay. What's involved in church planting?
Getting people saved.
Okay.
Discipling them.
Okay.
Training them to start their own churches.
Okay. Did you have one?
Yeah, for the foreign one, to, see them saved, disciple, strengthen enough that, the national can take over.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So when I'm thinking about a foreign missionary, what I want to hear them say is, we're trying to start a church through preaching the gospel, making disciples, and focusing on training the next generation so we can turn the church over. And if that's what a person's heartbeat is, that's going to come out. They're going to say that. If they don't, if that's not their heartbeat, other things are going to come out. And when I'm reading one of these, if I look at somebody and I go, I think this is a person that actually could be helped by some conversations, I'll have those conversations. And a person who maybe is not super formed in those areas, but I think that they're moving in the right direction, I may have them in. Even though they're not as rigorous as I'd like to see them, and it just could be the context they come from. But I want to see that. For an American church planter, it's going to be a little different. I want to know, is this a church planter who sees himself as starting a church and then getting somebody else in there and they're going to start another one, or do they want to start a church and stay there for 20, 30 years? And it's more of a curiosity thing. It's helping me know, what will our relationship be like long term with this person. This is someone who wants to start a church that's eventually going to support them. So maybe we're looking at a 2-year commitment with this person, or maybe this is someone who is going to be here for a while. Somebody takes it and then they're going to start another one, and we may try to continue to maintain a relationship with them for a longer period of time, and they're never going to have a church that fully supports them. I'd like to know that on the front side based on what their burden is. Next question, and this is for foreign missionaries. Do you believe in the indigenous principle, and if so, explain what it is? Now, I know this word indigenous now is getting to mean other things. So I don't know if this is a word that I should still use or not. I have no problem with the word. But when I think of indigenous principle, what I mean by that is that a church is supposed to be pastored by local people. And that church should most likely look like the community in which it's planted. So if I was planting a church in Baltimore City that was in a more inner city type of situation, I would expect that demographically that church was going to look like that area. Or if it's a primarily Latino community where most of the people are speaking Spanish, it was an area that's got a lot of immigrants, so it's going to be very ethnically diverse. I'm expecting that is going to be the dynamic. And when I'm going into a foreign context where you have multiple languages, I'm expecting that the primary language in that area, that will probably be the language, heart language of the person who's pastoring that church long term. Now, in a place like Ghana, you had a unique situation where you didn't have just one language that was spoken. So some people might speak Ga. That would be, it's called Ghana. The Gas are from Accra. But the Ashantis were speaking Twi, and that was the primary people. It was an empire, honestly, for a lot of the history. Or then in the area where we lived, the people were Fanti, and they spoke Fanti. Well, Twi and Fanti are very similar, but they're a little different. Ga's a different language. And then we had people that were Ewe. They came from eastern Ghana. And what would happen is in our church, we'd have people that spoke English, they spoke French, they spoke Ga, they spoke Ewe, they spoke Twi, they spoke Fanti. So the question is, what's that church going to look like? Well, probably someone who speaks the predominant language, but is able to flow with these others is what you're looking at. But that's what we mean by indigenous. For a foreigner to pastor a church in another land indefinitely, long term, it's always going to have a stigmatization attached with it. In the same way that a person, even I hate to say this, but even within some of the racial demographics in America, there are certain churches that would not receive a pastor from a different ethnic background. You say, well, that's sinful and wrong, and I don't disagree with you. But the bottom line is that they're not all mature believers in a church. And so you end up having these kinds of contentions in certain areas. And so a church needs to look like the context that it's in. And I do think that this can be abused. Like, for instance, when we were in Ghana, we used to really emphasize this as a Fonte church, Fonte church, Fonte church. And then I started seeing that there are people that were not Fontes who felt uncomfortable at church. And I was like, okay, we're a church. We're the church of Christ. And so if somebody's Fonte, if they're Ashanti, if they're God, they're Elway, doesn't matter. They should feel welcome in our church. We had a lady from Russia who attended our church in Ghana. We had a lady from China who attended our church in Ghana. We had some Americans. We had some Germans who came to our church. It was actually more ethnically diverse than Anchor is, as weird as that would sound, because of the area where we lived. And we tried to encourage people, minister to whoever comes into these doors, and love them. But the indigenous principle is a local person is going to pastor that church best. And so we want to train a local person. We want the church to be autonomous, self-governing. We want it to be financially independent, self-supporting. And we want it to be reproducing. That means it's going to actually be strong enough that it can send out from its own church. A lot in that question. Any questions or clarifications in that? Okay.
I have a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
You ever seen the African Humphrey Bogart, Patrick Hepburn?
No.
The opening scene is how not to do a church.
How not to do a church.
Catherine Hepburn and her brother are a missionary team, and they're singing in English to these Africans who are just making noises because they don't know what's going on.
Well, as sad as it would be to say this, there are definitely missionaries who go into foreign contexts and they do that. They want the church to, people wear coat and tie. Nobody in that culture wears a coat and tie. They want them to learn English so they can study the Bible in English. And, people don't speak English in their heart language. They try to bring in practices that are clearly Western American practices that are not, you wouldn't say that they're absolutely biblical. I'm not saying that they're violating Scripture necessarily, but they're culturally Western, and so we have to be so cautious about that. And I think a person that is in a church context that preaches expositionally and is emphasizing the right things, they're going to go into a context and do well. But if someone comes from a church that's very isolated in how they think about things, it won't be good. So, yep. Next one. Do you believe that a missionary church planter should pastor one ministry that will function as a long-term mother church, or work for the church's birth, from the church's birth, to turn it over entirely to well-qualified national pastors? Really what I'm doing there is I'm taking the indigenous principle and I'm expanding it a little bit to help people that don't understand what that is, okay? And, if we, in the United States, when you have a church that sort of has all these little satellite churches and they're showing the one church's live stream, and essentially they're all a conglomerate of one church. When we look at that, I think we go, something's a little off there. Something's a little off. And when we look at the Anglican form of church government, where you have, a bishop who oversees all of these congregations, he's not a pastor of a congregation, he's the pastor of the pastors, and they're under that authority. We look at that and we say, well, that's clearly not Baptist. That's not a Baptist church polity. But there are Baptists who would say, I'm absolutely a Baptist, but they will take that same approach into missions. They'll say, well, I'm a missionary. I'm the most qualified to teach and preach God's word because I have the most training, and everybody else that's learning, doesn't have the same level of experience and all those things. So I'm the one who needs to do this. There are definitely missionaries that have this mindset. And what ends up happening is they push down people who have the potential to do far better than they do because they don't have the cultural stigmatization. They don't have the language barrier. They understand their culture. And it can be a healthy, thriving church. But instead of teaching people and giving them the opportunity to go and do far better and exponentially expand their ministry labors, they got to control it all. And you'd be surprised how many people say, well, absolutely, the mother church model is what I do. And they have no question that that's what they think is best. And that's not, we don't want to work with missionaries like that. Okay, explain how you approach funding the work. This is a really tough issue. And I would say unless somebody's been on a foreign field, they don't appreciate how complex this is. Because if you take the approach, I will put no money into this church, then the question is, how are you going to be able to train people? Because they work full-time jobs. Are you going to, they're going to work a full-time job and then you're going to teach them at night? I mean, what are you going to do? How are you going to handle this? But when you start putting money into the picture, then you start incentivizing people who can actually make more money being in your Bible Institute, being a pastor potentially, than working a job in their area. It's actually a more secure job because you're not gonna cheat them. You're gonna pay them every month, and not that you're gonna. I mean, the work it's not gonna be as labor as intensive as being a brick mason or working on a roof in the heat or something like that. And so some people be incentivized into this work to say, it's a pretty good gig. I got a steady income. I know how much it's going to be. People respect me and like me. So when you start injecting money into the situation, all of a sudden you have a complication. And when the people in the community see that money is injected into the situation, all of a sudden they may look at this person who's going into ministry who actually is going in for the right reason. They say, well, I know why you're really doing this. Because you used to do this for work, and now you're doing this for work, and this is better for you than that was. And so you have to really be cautious about these situations where someone might say, well, I'll tithe to my church, and then my church will support this guy. Well, are you going to tithe the church the rest of its existence? Because your tithe may actually be more than the rest of the church is able to produce in 3 weeks, or 4 weeks, or a month. And so these are questions. Now, I don't necessarily have absolute answers on them. I mean, I can tell you what I did and what I learned worked or didn't work and what was good or bad. But I'd like to know that someone's thinking about this. I'd like to see what they have to say. If they haven't thought about it at all, I'm going to ask them why not. And if they are very dogmatic and it's pretty obvious that they don't know what they're talking about, I may ask them, do you understand the implication of what you're suggesting there? So that's something I'm interested in. How do you approach funding the work? Next, will you encourage the church to support itself from the start? If you establish a practice that churches in America are going to take care of a church in another country, guess what? That church is not going to take care of itself. It's true. What's the incentive? You say, well, God tells you you're supposed to give, and they're like, yeah, but we know it's coming. But when you teach them, this is the principle of giving, and this is what you need to do from the start, and they say, well, it's not very much. That's okay, but you obey God and you do the right thing. As that church grows, it gets to a point where eventually it actually could support a pastor. But if you don't teach that early on, and you give people the mindset that they're entitled to being supported from outside of their congregation, then they will become very, very self-centered and very entitled. In fact, we use the word entitlements in America. That's exactly what they are. Someone believes they don't have to work. They can just get a free handout. And it destroys people. They need to work. They need to actually feel like they're accomplishing something that's productive. And so I put that out there to see if people are thinking in this way, because it's so important. All right, before we get to the next one, any questions or comments there? Next question. This is for foreign missionaries. Will you encourage churches from the States to fund major projects, and if so, to what extent should the locals be involved? Again, this is a very tough question. I have missionary friends that will not ask the States for support of a project ever under any conditions. In fact, if a church in the States said, can we help you with a roof or bricks for your building, they say, no, it's not your responsibility to fund the project. It's this church's responsibility. I know missionaries like that. They're very, very dogmatic about it. I know other missionaries that are very dogmatic that these people do not have the resources to do this, and so they are constantly asking people in the States to give them funds towards projects. In my opinion, a middle ground is probably best. Because the truth is that it is very difficult I give you the example of the church in Ghana. When I went to Ghana in 2011, the exchange rate was 1.5 Ghana cedis per $1 US. Today, I think it's 11 or 12 Ghana cedis per US dollar. So if you were giving faithfully, let's say $10 worth of giving, in Ghana in 2011, and your church was saving that money in a bank, your money has almost no value today. It just doesn't. It's been depleted. That's what inflation does. Inflation robs people of their financial, of the value. It just does. And so what a bag of cement would have been 10 years ago, it's like a cup out of that bag today. I mean, that's what it is. So I think it's important for us to kind of have this perspective that we go, you know what? The question is, are the people taking responsibility to the extent they can, and can we be a blessing and an encouragement to them? And are they expecting this, or are we offering this without strings? We want to be a blessing. I think a middle ground is helpful there. And that's something I probably have drifted toward. I was more of the first approach. No help, do it yourself. And I give the example of our children. When our children go to college, there are some families, they pay their kids' tuition 100%. There are some that say, you're getting nothing. And they can give them and they don't. And there's some that say, I'd love to help you. This is what I can do, but you're going to have to come up with the rest. And there are some that say, I can help you, but I want you to work. I'm going to give you this amount to help you, but you've got to do the rest yourself. And the fact is that just giving someone a free ride is probably not best for them, but being callous and saying you're on your own, even though you can do it, probably isn't going to be taken very well either. So a middle ground would be helpful. Next, what marks of maturity in a church will you be watching that indicate the church plant is ready to be a self-supported, self-governing local church? Now, at the end of our time in Ghana, I would say that the things that in my mind I wanted to see were things I was starting to see. And because I was starting to see those things, I began to realize this is a church that needs to start moving towards independence, moving towards being turned over to local leadership. But if a person doesn't think about this, then they're not going to ever see it. It's going to take some kind of a conflict that's going to bring this to a head before a church gets turned over. And if you're not looking for marks of maturity, you're not shooting for them either. So one of the things that was a big deal to me is I wanted to see families in the church that were not just mom brings kids to church and dad's uninvolved. Hey, if a mom brings her kids to church and dad's not involved, I'm glad mom brings her kids to church. Don't get me wrong. But when dad's dragging his feet, guess what? That affects the household. Or when dad and mom both go to church, but it's clear mom's the one who's really engaged with church. Dad doesn't really care, but he goes along. That's a problem. But when I see fathers who are actually heads of households, they're teaching their kids the Word of God, They are working as a team with their wife. They're actually training their kids. They're disciplining their kids. They're doing things the right way. When I see family units like that and kids that are actually getting saved and growing in the Lord, I look at that and say, those are marks of maturity. And when I see several of those families, and that starts becoming the predominant culture of the church, that's how I know this is a church that is moving in the right direction. And so those are things that we look at. Next, how do you plan to support pastors training for ministry? Are you going to give them temporary support? Are you going to give them long-term support? Are you going to give them no support? Are you going to help them with their schooling? How are you going to do this? Are you going to have them work with teams where they're bivocational? A bivocational team can work together. A bivocational individual will probably get crushed under the ministry load. So this is something to consider. Do you see yourself as a long-term or short-term missionary? There are some people, and this is how I look at the issue, is that sometimes God calls people for seasons for certain tasks. And some people, they are very well equipped to be church planters, and they're there for a little while, and they move to the next church, and they plant that one, they move to another one, they plant it, and those are the seasons they're in. Some people, they work well alongside someone who's a little more aggressive like that, and they're more into the discipling and the training and the molding, and their season is different. And some people, they're temporary in those roles. And so I'm curious, how do you see yourself fitting into ministry? And if someone is younger and they don't have much ministry experience, they probably don't know how to answer that question. But if someone has been in ministry for a while, they probably have a better understanding of how God has fitted them. And that's a really good thing when they can see that, because they know exactly how they fit into what they're doing here, and they jump into it. Next, I only have 2 more questions. For foreign missionaries, how will you know when your work in a particular church is completed? When I'm dead. Okay, that could work. It'll be done. When I'm too old to physically do this. Well, some people aren't old when they physically can't do stuff. Some people can physically do stuff, but they probably should stop. How will you know when it is time to stop doing what you're doing? Some people say, well, you'll know. You'll know when it's time. Okay. But a lot of times when you know when it's time, it's because of some negative things that have brought it to that place. And so I'd like to get an idea of what people are thinking about that. And then lastly, explain how you see your relationship and accountability to your sending church and also to supporting churches. When we partner with a church planter, in my mind, they're not a member of our church, but they're an extension of the ministry we're doing. And so I know that there are missionaries I've inherited, and I didn't get to vet them. Some people, I've grown in my view on some of these issues, and so if I could do it over again, maybe I wouldn't do it the way I did it initially. But the fact is, we want missionaries who actually communicate with our church. There are some missionaries that I actually fairly regularly, I email with them, we do WhatsApp together, Signal, with the internet. I mean, I could have somebody in another part of the world, 5-6 hours different from here, and I can have an hour-and-a-half long conversation with them. It didn't cost me or them anything because they're on a Wi-Fi area and I'm on a Wi-Fi area. It's not an international call. It used to be, international calls are so expensive. It's not like that anymore. Calls don't get dropped. You can do a video call. And so I'd like to hear things like, if I have a real issue going on, I have a sending pastor who I call and I talk to him about those things. And I have supporting pastors that I'm close to. There are certain supporting pastors, when I was a missionary, to this day I'm still close to them. And we're still friends in ministry. There's a pastor friend that I have, he's a bit older than I am. And if I have a delicate issue I'm dealing with in counseling here at Anchor, I'll call him. And I'll say, hey, you don't know these people, you don't know anything about the situation, but let me give you a scenario and tell me what you would do in the situation. And he'll be like, oh, it's a mess. I'm glad I'm not dealing with that. Here's something to think about. Here's another thing to think about. And those things are helpful. My missions director, when I was on the field, great guy, somebody I still keep in contact with Josh, sent out of our church. I know he's here right now for a period of time, but the truth is, like, he and I, we fairly regularly would communicate. The issues that he's dealt with internally in his church, where he's had church discipline, delegates. I know about all those things because he called me and we talked through them. We prayed together. And so I want us to work with missionaries who value our relationship, because we value them. We're putting a lot of financial backing behind a church planter overseas. And so we want to see it as a real partnership. So, all right, any questions or comments here before we close? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not familiar with the mission field, so when you send a missionary out from this church, are they supported by other churches also?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the way it has worked with our church is that when we send out a missionary, we support them at 20% of their monthly support.
Okay.
So the missionary that's sent out of our church, we support him 20%. So 10% is out of our missions fund, and 10% is out of our general fund. We actually set aside an amount that every year goes toward that. And that's extremely helpful. And then when we have missionaries that come, there was a time when we were supporting them at 10% with a cap. Now, we kind of got away from that years ago, but we still do. We tend to support church planting missionaries overseas around $400 to $500 a month is what we do. So, yep. And so, in theory, if there were 10 churches that had the same approach that we had, that would be their supporting base. It actually wouldn't even have to be 10 churches, because they're sending churches, send them at 20%. But some churches at $75, $50, $100, $150. There's all differences. And a lot of them, their policies haven't really been reviewed since like the mid 70s or 80s, and that's why they're $50, $75. Because $50 or $75 really was a good bit of money, at that time. But with inflation, it's not much. And so, yeah. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, we're going to go ahead and stop there. We'll close in prayer and hope that was